One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy, and we're in the middle of a discussion about hormones and health, and we're spending some time talking about different types of hormones and their impact on health and wellness, and sometimes they're commingling. Over the last episode, we talked about a couple of different main topics. One was addressing some of the common questions that I get with my personal coaching clients that they have about hormones. One of the big ones is bioidentical versus synthetic, and then we also talked about the impact of different delivery systems, whether you're swallowing a pill or using a cream or getting something injected. And when you sit back and you look at the bigger picture, it is almost impossible to predict exactly how any mixture of those different elements is going to have an impact on an individual person's biochemistry. And part of that is because of, most of that I would say, is actually because of biochemical individuality, but also we have to understand that whenever we introduce a hormone, whether it is bioidentical or synthetic, whether it's a single hormone or a combination of hormones, or if we're using different types of delivery methods, each of which has its own pros and cons, we are introducing that into someone's biological terrain. And what that means is that if you don't have a handle on what that biological terrain is, then you can't always predict exactly what the outcome of that hormone will be. I think it's a little too simplistic to think that if I, as a man, just simply take testosterone, the only thing that's going to change is my testosterone. And we're going to explore this in a lot more detail, probably actually in the next episode, where we start to break down the 5 pillars. And I know I said I was going to do that a couple of episodes ago, but I've realized that there are still some topics that we need to discuss in laying the foundation. In fact, today, what I want to talk about is hormone testing methods. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, you don't necessarily want to introduce hormones into a system where there is already hormone sufficiency. And it is very tenuous, or let me say it this way, there is a tenuous relationship between hormone deficiencies or insufficiencies and symptomatology. And it's very common. You can just go to Google or any search engine and type in low progesterone symptoms or low testosterone symptoms. You'll get a host of things, and these lists tend to be the same pretty much no matter where you source them. But the problem is that regardless of what symptoms you get in these lists, these symptoms don't only come from that particular hormone being deficient. A lot of these symptoms are very broad in general, whether it's fatigue or poor sleep or whatever the case might be. And there's any number of other things that could potentially be causing that. And so just because you fill out a questionnaire, for example, and I do use certain types of questionnaires in my own practice, but if you fill out a questionnaire that purports to assess progesterone sufficiency just by giving you questions, and you come out with a bad score, so to speak, that doesn't mean that your progesterone levels are low. And we can, pretty much say that across the spectrum of human physiology. I can have somebody fill out a questionnaire that asks questions about blood sugar control and stability. And just because someone scores poorly in those sections doesn't mean they do have a blood sugar issue. And so testing is very, very important. But just like with different delivery methods, different types of testing have their pros and cons. And really there's 2 main camps, and that is whether or not we should be testing hormones in blood versus in saliva. And there are proponents of both. Both have good arguments for them, but also have some arguments against them. But one of the first things to start with is to understand that laboratory testing, regardless if it is, say, blood testing or if it is saliva testing, regardless of whether you're using a standard regional or national lab, say Quest or LabCorp, or if you're using a specialty lab, labs can only measure bioidentical hormones. Let me say it again. Labs can only measure bioidentical hormones. And what that means is that if somebody is taking a synthetic hormone of any kind, whether it's reproductive or thyroid or even insulin, for example, measuring that hormone directly is not going to give you the full measure of how much hormone that particular hormone is in your system. Because if you're taking synthetic hormones, that doesn't register in your blood or in your saliva. And so as a result of this, and this is a very well-known limitation of laboratory testing, as a result of that, doctors that do synthetic hormone replacement and do a lot of routine lab testing also, well, I should say they should, many do, some don't, they should also be looking at the corresponding hormones that come from the pituitary. And it might be easiest to use thyroid as an example, just simply because it's perhaps the most talked about, podcasted, and blogged about hormone and hormone imbalance that there is out there, being Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. But nevertheless, if you've been around the healthcare space for any period of time, you've probably heard lectures and topics discussed like this, that most docs are measuring TSH, and some of them don't even measure thyroid hormones, because they understand if someone's on synthetic thyroid hormones, the most revealing marker that you can test for to tell you how much hormone is in the system is the pituitary hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. And whether or not you have enough hormones is going to be reflected in whether or not your TSH level has been brought down to an appropriate value. And you have to remember that this is just the design of the system, that we have the brain talking to a gland, the gland that makes the hormones, and then the brain assesses whether or not there's enough hormone in the system, and then it adjusts pituitary output to help to regulate production, either by increasing it or decreasing it. And so with reproductive hormones, we have the same relationships. For example, luteinizing hormone from the pituitary produces progesterone in women and testosterone in men. And so as female progesterone levels go up, luteinizing hormone levels go down, because you don't need to make as much. And this is what we call a feedback control system. Same thing with luteinizing hormone and testosterone in a man. If testosterone is too low, luteinizing hormone should be elevated if the problem is in the testes itself. And as testosterone levels come back up, luteinizing hormones go down, just simply because the body and the brain, particularly, let's call it innate intelligence, is trying to regulate production so we don't get either overstimulation or understimulation. And so because synthetics don't register in tests, the standard methodology of assessing hormone sufficiency is by looking at these feedback hormones coming out of the pituitary. For example, if a woman, let's say a woman is in her reproductive years and for whatever reason she's on progesterone, a laboratory signal that she would have enough progesterone in her system would be an adequate or an appropriate level of luteinizing hormone for whatever stage of her reproductive cycle she was in, whether she was in the first 2 weeks of the cycle, the middle of the cycle, or the last 2 weeks of the cycle. And that rule holds true for all hormonal systems. So let me just kind of reiterate before I go too far down that bunny trail, is that labs can only measure synthetic hormones, which really raises the question, if you are on synthetic hormones and your doctor is testing the hormones that you're taking, you probably have a lot more in your body than what that level of that specific hormone is telling you. And again, it's just rooted in this reality that labs don't test bioidentical hormones. Now, if you're taking bioidentical hormones, then the laboratory data that you get when you measure those hormones specifically is a lot more accurate. We lose that accuracy with the synthetics, which is why they have to reflex back to measuring these feedback hormones that come out of the pituitary. So that's one of the first things. The next thing in terms of testing is, if you're on hormones particularly, should you take your hormones before or after your test? I get this question all the time. I'm getting my hormones done in 2 days. Should I take my progesterone, for example, or should I take my testosterone? And the answer to that is really up to the clinician who ordered the test and the question they're asking about how your body is working. And what I mean by that is, and again, this is true in other aspects of diagnostics and health and wellness as well, is that when you put together a diagnostic strategy, what you're testing and how you're testing it for it is really going to be determined or should be driven by the question you're asking of the body. Diagnostic tests, the results tell a story, if you will. And so the answers I get back from my test are answering a specific question. So if I tell somebody, let's say that I order progesterone, and I tell them to not take the progesterone the day or the morning of their test, the question I'm asking is, without hormone supplementation, how much are you able to make on your own? Hi there, it's Dr. Noseworthy. I want to extend my appreciation to all of you in the Inflammation Nation who have helped my podcast become a great success in these first few months. I truly appreciate you. Also wanted to let you know about my brand new do-it-yourself online program called the 5-Step Gut Protocol. I designed this program for people who want to take charge of their own health and stop waiting around for someone else to tell them what to do. I've combined old naturopathic principles with cutting-edge research to create a truly unique program that will help you construct your own gut protocol. If you've ever wondered if you have gut infections, a leaky gut, or a bad microbiome, then this program will walk you through the steps to figure that out and gives you the tools that you need to formulate a practical strategy to help make things better. I guarantee at the end of this course you'll know more about your gut than your doctor does, and you will feel confident that you know how to address your unique situation. You can check it out at my website at www.drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com. And just look for the tab at the top that says The Programs. Thanks for listening. Now, there's a little bit of a fudge factor in there because all these hormones have a half-life. Some are shorter, some are longer. And what that means is I could be taking a hormone that has a very long half-life, has a long period of time where it clears out from my system. And if I want to get a true picture of what my body is producing on its own, I might want to have that person avoid taking that hormone for days, if not a week or more prior to the test. Now, in terms of functionality, and this is where the functional medicine perspective comes in, hopefully the reason why somebody is on hormone replacement is because someone has already asked the question, how does your system perform on its own? And the answer is not well. So I tend to assume, maybe I shouldn't, but I do. I tend to assume that all doctors that are out there have, number one, good intentions, they're reasonably well-trained and educated, and they probably did a good job in their analysis. Now, obviously that's not always true, but I would rather give people the benefit of the doubt than just assume that everybody's wrong and I'm always right. But if I have a client who has another clinician that has prescribed hormone replacement therapy for them, my main question is not, how does your body do on its own? And that might be a question for somewhere down the line, if there is a correctable problem that allows the system to rebalance itself without having to resort to hormone replacement. But nevertheless, at some point, you have to ask the question, is this dosing amount and is this delivery method doing the job that we want to do? And if that's the question you're asking, then you really need to take your hormones before you take your test. And there's a window of time, and I'm going to say generally it's about 4 hours. So as a general rule, and this is how I operate, if the question I'm asking of somebody's body through diagnostic testing is whether or not their hormone replacement protocol is appropriate, including not just the dosing, but the delivery method, I'm going to have them take that hormone 4 hours before they do their test because I want to see how their physiology works when that's in their system, preferably at its peak concentration or somewhere pretty close to that. So whether or not you take hormones before or after your test, again, really just depends on the question you're asking. Are you assessing the efficacy of your current protocol, or are you trying to answer the question or ask the question, how does my body do without the hormone? How does my body do on its own? And for the most part, if people are on hormones, then someone along the way has answered that question and said your body's not doing what it should. Therefore, that's why they're on hormone replacement therapy. And that's just a kind of very good general principle to remember all the time, is that every single time you or your clinician, whoever your healthcare practitioner is, whenever they order a test and you agree to that, you really have to be clear on what question are you asking? What answers are we trying to get? And what's this going to tell us? And sometimes people order tests just as a matter of routine. Well, this is just how we always do it. And sometimes I think that that is an appropriate answer. But sometimes I think we need to delve just a little bit deeper. So those are two big issues. Number one, labs don't test synthetic hormones. They only test bioidenticals. And so if you're on synthetics, you have to be careful interpreting your lab data. And then whether or not you take hormones before or after you do your testing is really going to depend on what your perspective is. What question are you asking, or what aspect of function or the protocol is it you're trying to assess? One of the other questions that comes up in terms of the testing is whether or not we test in serum versus saliva. So let's talk just a little bit about that in why you might want to go in one direction versus another. And again, if you look out certainly in clinical practice, I would say that most of conventional medicine, conventional endocrinology, will tell you that saliva testing is inaccurate, it's unreliable, it's not repeatable, not reproducible. That might have been true 50 years ago. It's not true today. And in fact, many of the research papers that are being published in the last, I've seen a handful just in the last several months that actually use saliva as their testing methodology in the field of research. And I think that's probably a nod to the accuracy. But nevertheless, you still have a lot of docs that say that the only accurate and reliable test is a blood test. And then on the other hand, you have the camp that says, well, saliva is the only way to do it. Serum is not going to give you the answers. And the truth is, they're both good. It just depends on why you're testing and what you're looking for. Just kind of like the question that we asked before, do I take hormones before or after my test? Well, do I want to test in blood or do I want to test in saliva? And even to stretch that just a little bit further, is there a place where you might actually want to do both? And the answer is yes, but it depends on certain other variables and certain other factors. So you might remember in a previous episode, we talked about how all hormones exist in one of two states in the body. They're either free fraction, meaning there's nothing attached to them, they're floating around by themselves. These are the ones that are biologically active, can bind to receptors and make something happen. Then the other way that hormones travel around are they're bound to a carrier protein. We call it the protein-bound fraction. And that protein that's stuck onto the hormone itself kind of changes the shape, the molecular weight, and it basically means that it can't dock with a receptor, can't make stuff happen. So we look at protein-bound hormones as being biologically inactive. And I also said or shared that the vast majority, 99+% of all hormones in circulation are protein-bound, and a very, very, very small fraction are in the free fraction biologically active state because we don't want our system to get overstimulated. This is part of our innate intelligence. So what does that mean in terms of testing? Well, if you run just a progesterone test in blood, for example, and your doctor just orders progesterone and that's all it says, what you're getting is total progesterone. Same thing with total. Sometimes the lab will actually say this is total testosterone, this is total estrogen, this is total progesterone. And what the total means is that it's both free fraction plus the protein bound. That's what total means. It has both of those elements in it. But because the free fraction is such a very, very small percentage, in essence, let's say in practicality, if you're measuring your total proteins, you're really looking at predominantly your protein-bound biologically inactive fraction. And remember, 99+%, sometimes 99.97% if you're looking at T4 hormone, thyroid hormones, are protein-bound. And so it's almost exclusively. So one way to think of it is that if you're testing in blood, unless the test says free fill in the blank with a hormone, then what you're looking at is the protein-bound fraction, which means that the hormones are biologically inactive. Now, could it be that you have a normal total / protein-bound / biologically inactive fraction, but you have an imbalance in the free fraction? And the answer is yes, you can, which is why a lot of people say, well, we need to be doing saliva testing because that naturally tests all hormones in the free fraction state. Any hormone that you can test through saliva is automatically free fraction, which means one of the big differences between blood testing and saliva testing in general is that you're looking at biologically inactive versus free fraction hormones. Free fraction biologically active hormones, meaning saliva is free fraction biologically active and blood is protein bound and biologically inactive. But that's only true if the lab you're working with does not offer a blood test for the free fraction. And some labs do and some labs don't. And even with the national labs like Quest and LabCorp, they offer some hormones in the free fraction and the rest is just the total, and that's all you get. And so you might be working with a lab, for example, that only offers a couple of hormones in the free fraction, and great, you can accurately measure that in the blood test. But there might be other hormones that you're interested in that lab does not offer in free fraction. So you either go find a different lab to do a blood test that offers free fraction biologically active hormones, or you use saliva. Now, saliva is easy, it's convenient, you don't get a blood stick, you can do it at home, they're relatively inexpensive. All of these, there's a lot of pros, honestly, to saliva testing. So let's get back to this idea of whatever test you run, you're trying to answer a specific question. If I, as a clinician, order a blood test for hormones and I'm not specifying I want the free fraction, I'm just looking at the total, which is almost exclusively protein bound, biologically inactive, then presumably the question I'm asking is how many hormones or how much of this hormone is your body producing? Because when your body produces hormones, they are very quickly bound to these inactivating carrier proteins. And so a protein-bound hormone level is our best reflection of the output of the producing gland or system. So if I want to ask the question, how much estrogen or progesterone is my client's ovarian system making, I'm going to look for total protein output, and that is almost exclusively protein-bound, biologically inactive. And that's a very valid question. In fact, that is, perhaps the first question when the question of hormone deficiency comes up. I'm not typically asking the question, what is the free fraction? I want to know what the system is making. I want to know what it's making. And so in that sense, I'm going to order a total hormone count from blood. That's the way to do that. However, sometimes the question is not how much is my system making. Sometimes the question is how much free fraction hormone is available at the cellular level to engage my receptors to create function. And that's an appropriate question to ask, number one, in an initial assessment. I mean, if you're doing comprehensive testing, I think you need to look at both total as well as free fraction. That's my opinion. But if the question I'm asking, let's say somebody's on some kind of a hormone protocol and they're using hormone replacement of some kind, whether it's topical or injection or whatever, ultimately when it comes down to function and symptom control and promoting health and wellness, I'm ultimately going to want to know what are the cells being exposed to. And I can only get that one of two ways. I either get it in saliva automatically, or if I'm lucky enough to work with a lab that offers free fraction hormone testing for the hormone I'm interested in blood, then that's perfectly fine too. So it really doesn't have to be this. You might remember an old Miller Lite commercial where there was this argument, tastes great, less filling. Well, which is it? Well, maybe it can be both. And the same thing holds true with blood testing as well as saliva testing, is that it doesn't have to be either or. We don't have to divide into camps and argue who's right and who's more scientific, which unfortunately is quite often what it comes down to. What we have to do is be a little bit more discerning and ask the question, well, what question are we asking? Do I want to know about production? Yeah, I probably better be doing total protein levels in blood. But do I want to know what's biologically active and available for my cells to drive function? Then I want to be free fraction testing. And that's either saliva, because it happens automatically. I don't have to order it that way. That's just the way it is. Or I find a lab that does free fraction hormone testing in blood for the hormones I'm interested in. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to find, just depending on which labs are available to you. And so I think that when you understand all these different variables, then it's pretty easy to see how a well-intended clinician can choose the wrong test or choose the wrong test for the question they're asking, the clinical question they're asking, and then assume that the results are telling them about the question they're asking when in fact it's not. And then perhaps to choose a delivery method that might be inappropriate for the biological terrain of the individual person who's taking the hormones. And then all of a sudden they wonder, well, I don't know why this isn't working, because it usually works for everybody else. It's because, number one, you're dealing with unique individuals. And if you don't know what can happen to hormones once you dump them into the system, it's hard to predict what the outcome will be. And if your clinician is not up to speed on the pros and cons of different hormone delivery methods, or if they're really bought into this is the one way to do it all the time and that's just their shtick, or if they don't understand that when you put together testing, you're trying to get answers to specific questions that relate to the clinical reality, then it's very easy to see how things can go wrong and could go sideways. Now, I'm watching my time here, and I've spent a little bit more time talking about this, so I'm unfortunately going to have to delay talking about the 5 pillars of hormone balance and control until another episode, probably 2 down the line, just because there's a few more things that I want to talk about in terms of hormone testing as it relates to testing for men and women, and as it relates to how do you test appropriately for women who are different ages of the reproductive life cycle. So whether they have their menstrual cycle, whether they're peri or postmenopausal, all of these things factor into how do you test appropriately, and then how do you interpret the results. So we'll leave it there for today, and we'll see you again on the next episode of Inflammation Nation. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.